Their laughter, that's what I remember most vividly. Sharp, triumphant, echoing in the vast, opulent silence that crashed down the instant my father spat out the words, "You are no longer my daughter." He'd cast me out, his face a stony mask of fury I barely recognized. And my stepmother Brenda, along with her two snickering adult children Leo and Tiffany, couldn't have been more delighted. Their smirks stretched, their eyes gleamed with pure, unadulterated victory. They thought they'd won. They believed they'd successfully erased me from his life, from the family, from everything. They laughed, a full-throated, joyous sound that felt like shards of glass in my heart. Little did they know, my father had one last deeply buried secret, a final act of defiance tucked away, waiting patiently to turn their victorious cackles into stunned, horrified silence. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. My life, before the storm of Brenda, was quiet, simple. As a young woman, Clara, was carving out my own small niche in the world. I worked as a junior graphic designer at a lively little firm downtown. The pay wasn't incredible, but the thrill of creating something from nothing, of seeing my designs come to life, that was a reward in itself. My tiny apartment, filled with a charming mismatch of second-hand furniture I'd lovingly restored and an ever-expanding collection of houseplants, was my sanctuary. It was small, yes, but it was mine, paid for with my own hard work. My days were a comfortable pattern of design briefs, endless cups of slightly too strong coffee, and the quiet hum of the city outside my window. Weekends were for browsing antique shops for hidden treasures, losing myself in sketches at the local park, or sharing cheap pizza and loud laughter with my close-knit group of friends. This was my normal, my stable ground. Before Brenda descended upon our lives, my father and I shared a bond forged in shared grief and resilient love. My mother had passed away when I was only 12, a devastating blow that left our small family fractured. But Dad, he'd rallied. He learned to manage my unruly hair, his attempts often resulting in lopsided braids that I wore with pride. He never missed a school concert or a parent-teacher night, his supportive presence a constant reassurance. He taught me practical things like how to change a flat tire, and more profound lessons like the importance of integrity and kindness. Our home back then was smaller, cozier, still holding the faint, comforting scent of my mother's favorite lavender soap and the comforting presence of her beloved books. He was a successful businessman even then, but his success felt different, a source of security, not a symbol of status to be coveted or weaponized. He cherished honesty, diligence, and compassion, values he meticulously instilled in me. These were the memories I clung to, the foundation I believed was unshakable, especially as Brenda's influence began to cast long, cold shadows. I was building my own life, content and proud, guided by the very principles he had taught me, or so I believed. Then Brenda arrived, a whirlwind of expensive perfume, dazzling smiles, and declarations of undying love for my father. She was a widow with 2 children of her own, Leo and Tiffany. They were a few years older than me and seemed to have been born with a PhD in condescension. My father, who had been lonely for so many years, was completely enchanted. I was a young woman then, still clinging to a shred of youthful optimism, hoping against hope for a harmonious blended family, like something out of a cheesy sitcom. My naivety was almost painful in retrospect. Brenda's charm, I soon realized, was a meticulously crafted facade. Beneath the saccharine sweetness, I sensed a core of icy calculation. Her eyes, even when her smile was at its widest and most dazzling, held a perpetually appraising glint, like she was constantly weighing everyone's worth, or perhaps their usefulness. Leo and Tiffany were far less skilled in their deceptions. They openly mocked my aspirations, my simple clothes, my boring life. Their worlds revolved around designer labels, social climbing, and most importantly, how much of my father's considerable wealth they could now access. The disruption to my life, to my relationship with my father, began with insidious subtlety. Little comments from Brenda, dropped like tiny, slow-acting poison pellets into my father's ear. "Clara seems so preoccupied lately, dear, don't you think she's pulling away?" Or, "I bought Clara that beautiful cashmere sweater, but she hasn't worn it once. I do hope she wasn't offended by the color." Each carefully worded remark was designed to paint me as ungrateful, aloof, or difficult. My father, increasingly blinded by what he desperately wanted to believe was true love, started viewing me through Brenda's distorted lens. The familiar warmth in his gaze when he looked at me began to cool, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a growing disappointment. The solid ground I thought I stood on was rapidly turning into treacherous quicksand. I vividly recall one evening, bubbling with excitement, I told Dad about a small but significant freelance design project I'd landed. Before he could respond, Brenda interjected, her voice smooth as silk. "Oh, that's nice, Clara. But your father was just telling me about Leo's incredible internship offer at that prestigious international investment bank. Such drive, such ambition." The comparison was a sharp jab my small victory instantly belittled. A tight, persistent knot of unease began to form in my stomach, a permanent, unwelcome guest I couldn't seem to shake. The carefully aimed digs and subtle manipulations, however, soon proved insufficient for Brenda and her insatiable offspring. Things began to escalate, insidiously at first, then with a gathering, terrifying momentum. It felt like I was being slowly dismantled, piece by piece, by a flock of perfectly coiffed, smiling vultures. Passive aggression became Brenda's preferred art form. She'd conveniently forget to inform me about family gatherings until the very last minute, ensuring I was always late, flustered, and appearing disrespectful. She'd take my mother's cherished belongings from the living room, replacing them with her own ostentatious, modern trinkets. When I dared to voice a mild protest, my voice trembling, she'd put on a display of profound hurt, accusing me to my father of clinging morbidly to the past and making it impossible for her to feel truly at home. Leo and Tiffany, emboldened by their mother's strategic successes, grew more openly contemptuous. They'd accidentally spill coffee on my university textbooks or borrow sentimental items, like a small music box my mother had given me, only for them to reappear weeks later, mysteriously damaged or stained. My increasingly desperate attempts to speak to my father to make him see were systematically thwarted. Brenda was always there, her arm possessively linked through his, her voice dripping with false concern as she'd murmur, "Darling, Clara is just being overly sensitive. She's young, she's finding it difficult to adjust, that's all." He'd nod, his brow furrowed with a misplaced worry that was always directed at me, never at the true architects of the discord. I began to feel like an unwelcome apparition in the house I had grown up in. My opinions were casually dismissed, my presence barely acknowledged, let alone tolerated. Cherished family traditions, intimate rituals Dad and I had shared for years, were either unceremoniously scrapped or callously altered to exclude me. Christmas, once my favorite holiday, became an annual exercise in quiet humiliation. Brenda made a point of ensuring my gifts were noticeably less expensive or thoughtful than the lavish presents showered upon Leo and Tiffany, a very public and deliberate demonstration of my rapidly diminishing status within the family. I remember my 21st birthday with a particular ache. Dad had always made a huge fuss over birthdays. That year, however, Brenda orchestrated a magnificent, extravagant party for Tiffany, whose birthday fell the week after mine. My own milestone was marked by a tense, awkward dinner where Brenda presented me with a flourish, a self-help book pointedly titled Overcoming Sibling Rivalry and Jealousy. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. A cold, hard suspicion began to crystallize within me. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this wasn't merely about me being difficult or oversensitive. This was a meticulously planned campaign to isolate and oust me, to secure their uncontested claim on my father and his fortune. But what could I possibly do? I was young, inexperienced in such Machiavellian tactics, and utterly powerless against Brenda's insidious charm and my father's deepening delusion. I tried to keep a journal to document the instances of their malice, but on paper, the individual events sounded almost trivial, easily dismissed as unfortunate misunderstandings or misinterpretations. The sense of impending doom grew heavier with each passing week. I was constantly walking on eggshells, bracing myself for the next subtle slight or overt attack, and the very air in that house, once filled with laughter and love, now crackled with unspoken, suffocating hostility. The situation finally imploded with a viciousness that still makes my stomach churn even now, years later. Brenda, I'm convinced, realized that her campaign of slow, subtle erosion wasn't achieving her goals quickly enough. She needed something dramatic, something irrefutable, to permanently sever the bond between my father and me. And she found her weapon, or rather, she meticulously manufactured it. My grandmother's antique pearl necklace, a delicate, irreplaceable strand that my mother had adored and had specifically left to me in her will, suddenly and inexplicably went missing. Brenda orchestrated a theatrical, frantic search of the house, her face a perfect mask of deep concern and distress, all the while subtly, skillfully planting seeds of doubt and suspicion about my supposed irresponsibility, even darkly hinting at a desperate financial situation I might be in. A few agonizing days later, with a flourish worthy of a stage actress, Brenda triumphantly found the necklace. It was cunningly tucked away in an old, forgotten jewelry box of mine. A box I hadn't opened in years, stored in the back of my closet at their house, a room I rarely even entered anymore. It was a sickeningly perfect, diabolical setup. She presented it to my father, her eyes welling with crocodile tears, lamenting how she'd hated to even entertain the thought, but the unspoken accusation hung heavy and poisonous in the air. I, Clara, his own daughter, had stolen it, presumably to sell it for cash. It was an outrageous, monstrous lie, but it was a lie my father, already so thoroughly conditioned by Brenda's relentless whispers, was tragically primed to believe. He confronted me later that evening, his voice trembling not with sorrow, but with a towering, unfamiliar rage. "How could you?" he thundered, his face contorted. "After everything I've provided for you, everything I've done for you? To stoop so low as to steal from your own sainted grandmother's memory?" My desperate denials, my choked pleas for him to listen, my frantic attempts to explain the impossibility of it all, were completely drowned out by Brenda's expertly feigned sobs and Leo and Tiffany's smug, knowing glances. They had me trapped perfectly and cruelly. The final public execution of our relationship came a week later, at what was supposed to be a grand, celebratory dinner for my father's 60th birthday. Brenda, naturally, had insisted on a large, formal, ostentatious affair at their lavishly redecorated home. I hadn't wanted to attend, the thought filling me with dread, but a tiny, foolish ember of hope still flickered within me, a desperate wish that I could somehow break through, somehow make my father see the truth. In front of a room filled with extended family, his oldest friends and influential business associates, after a nauseatingly saccharine toast from Brenda praising his generosity and wisdom, my father stood up. His face was grim, his eyes cold as ice. He didn't look at me, not even once. He announced, his voice resonating with chilling finality, that due to irreconcilable differences and profound personal disappointments, he was severing all ties with me. Then came those brutal, life-altering words, each one a hammer blow. "You are no longer my daughter." The shock was a physical force stealing the air from my lungs. The entire room fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence, broken only by a few stifled gasps. And then I heard it. The unmistakable, triumphant snickers from Leo and Tiffany, the barely suppressed, victorious smile playing on Brenda's lips. They were basking in their triumph, their faces alight with malicious glee. Utterly humiliated, heartbroken beyond words, and feeling more alone than I ever had in my life, I fled. I didn't even think to grab my coat or my bag. I just ran, their hideous, mocking laughter chasing me out into the cold, unforgiving night. That was the very last time I saw my father alive. The door to that life, to that family, had been violently slammed shut, bolted, and irrevocably sealed with their cruel, cutting scorn. Years drifted by, like leaves on an autumn wind. The raw, searing pain of that night eventually dulled, but the scar tissue remained, a tender, permanent reminder of the betrayal. I poured all my energy into my career, slowly but surely building a respected name for myself in the design world. I found love, a deep and steady love, with a wonderful man named Ben. He knew my fractured story, listened without judgment, and supported me unconditionally. Together we built a quiet, contented life, a peaceful haven far removed from the drama and toxicity I had been so desperate to escape. I rarely allowed myself to think about my father, or when I did, it was with a confusing, tangled mess of lingering childhood affection, profound hurt, and a deep, unarticulated sorrow. I heard snippets through the distant family grapevine, very occasionally whispers about his steadily declining health, Brenda's ever-escalating social ambitions, Leo and Tiffany's increasingly ostentatious and reckless spending. I expected nothing from them, I wanted nothing from them. I firmly told myself, moved on. Then one crisp, golden autumn afternoon, an official-looking cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. It bore the embossed letterhead of Henderson and Associates, a name that stirred a faint, distant memory. Mr. Henderson Sr. had been my father's most trusted legal counsel for decades, a stern but impeccably fair man from the years before Brenda's arrival. I almost tossed it into the recycling bin, assuming it was some misdirected piece of junk mail. But a nagging flicker of curiosity, a strange premonition, made me pause. Inside, a single, stiffly formal letter requested my presence at his downtown office for a matter of significant personal importance. My heart gave an odd, unexpected lurch. Ben, ever my rock, gently encouraged me to go. "What if it is something important, Clara?" he'd said. "You deserve to know, whatever it is." A few days later, I walked into Mr. Henderson's old-fashioned, mahogany-paneled office, my palms slick with nervous sweat. He was visibly older now, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes, behind his spectacles, were as sharp and discerning as I remembered. He greeted me with a somber courtesy and then, very gently, informed me that my father had passed away peacefully a week prior. A complex wave of grief washed over me, a profound sadness for the kind, loving man he once was, a bitter regret for the stolen years, and a strange, unexpected pang of definitive loss. I murmured my condolences, my mind reeling, completely unsure why I had been summoned. Surely Brenda and her children would inherit everything. I was, after all, officially disowned. Mr. Henderson then leaned forward, his expression becoming unreadable, almost conspiratorial. "Clara," he began, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone, "your father, well, he made some rather specific arrangements some years ago. Arrangements, I must stress, of which Brenda is entirely unaware." My breath hitched in my throat. He went on to explain that not long after the traumatic disownment, after I had been publicly cast out, my father, during a period when his physical health was still relatively stable but perhaps his conscience was beginning to stir, had secretly visited him. He had been deeply troubled, agitated even, though he never explicitly stated the reasons for his distress at that time. He had, Mr. Henderson revealed, created a second will, secret will, and alongside it, a lengthy, handwritten letter addressed to me. My father, it turned out, possessed substantial assets that Brenda knew absolutely nothing about, valuable investments and prime properties inherited directly from his own parents, kept entirely separate and distinct from the considerable wealth he had accumulated during his marriage to her. This secret will, Mr. Henderson explained, his gaze steady on mine, named me as the sole and exclusive beneficiary of this entire hidden fortune. My head was spinning, the room tilting slightly. Disowned, yet secretly remembered, secretly provided for? Felt surreal, impossible. Then he slid a thick envelope across the polished desk towards me. My father's familiar, elegant handwriting, a little shakier than I recalled, covered dozens of pages. It was an apology, a confession, a desperate, heartfelt explanation. He wrote of his slow, agonizing, dawning realization of Brenda's insidious manipulations, of how she had systematically poisoned him against me, his own flesh and blood. He wrote of his profound shame, his crushing regret, and his quiet, distant pride in watching me from afar build my own life with integrity and strength. He humbly, heartbreakingly asked for my forgiveness. Tears streamed unchecked down my face as I read his words, each one a balm to old wounds. It wasn't just about the money, I realized with sudden, startling clarity. It was about the truth. It was about a father, however flawed, however broken, trying to make a desperate final amends from beyond the grave. The power dynamic, I understood with a jolt that shot through me, was about to shift spectacularly and irrevocably. The official reading of the wills, for there were indeed two, was scheduled for the following week, in Mr. Henderson's imposing wood-paneled conference room. Ben held my hand tightly, his presence a silent source of strength as we walked in. Brenda, Leo, and Tiffany were already strategically positioned around the large mahogany table, draped in expensive, ostentatiously somber black attire that did little to conceal their palpable air of smug, barely contained anticipation. Brenda shot me a look that was a venomous cocktail of feigned surprise and undisguised disdain. "Claire," she hissed, her voice loud enough for the handful of distant relatives and my father's former business partners, also present, to hear clearly. "What on earth are you doing here?" I simply met her icy gaze, my own expression deliberately calm, and stated quietly, "Mr. Henderson invited me." Mr. Henderson, a figure of solemn authority, began by reading what everyone in the room, including Brenda and her cohort, confidently believed to be the one and only will. It was on the surface quite straightforward. The main family home, a significant but not outrageously enormous sum of money, and various personal effects were bequeathed to Brenda. Leo and Tiffany each received generous but not life-altering trust funds. They exchanged small, self-satisfied smiles. Brenda even managed to conjure a few tears, dabbing at her eyes delicately with a fine lace handkerchief, the very picture of a bereaved, yet comfortably provided-for widow. Leo couldn't resist a quick, triumphant smirk in my direction, a look that clearly communicated, "See? You get exactly what you deserve. Nothing." I remained perfectly still, outwardly composed, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was their moment of supreme triumph, the final, satisfying culmination of all their years of scheming. Or so they fervently believed. Once that part of the proceedings was concluded, and the polite, slightly awkward murmurs of condolence began to fill the room, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, a precise, deliberate sound that sliced through the low hum of conversation. "There is," he announced, his voice suddenly firm, carrying a new and unexpected weight, "another document. A subsequent and therefore overriding testamentary disposition, executed by Mr. Thorne at a later date, along with a personal letter which he instructed is to be read aloud to all present." A stunned, electric silence instantly descended upon the room. Brenda's perfectly composed, grieving facade froze, then began to crack. Her eyes darted frantically towards Mr. Henderson, then sharply to me, a flicker of dawning, horrified unease finally visible. Leo and Tiffany looked momentarily confused, then visibly annoyed. "Another will?" Brenda managed to stammer, her voice suddenly shrill, losing its carefully cultivated refinement. "What are you talking about? That is utterly impossible. Preposterous." Mr. Henderson simply raised a single eloquent eyebrow and without further comment began to read. This will was vastly, shockingly different. It meticulously detailed the ancestral properties, a portfolio of sprawling countryside estates and city apartments Brenda had clearly never known existed. It listed a carefully curated collection of blue-chip stocks, a private, priceless art collection, and offshore accounts, assets my father had guarded fiercely from her grasping reach. And every single item, every last penny of this considerable, carefully concealed fortune, was bequeathed solely and unequivocally to me, Clara Thorne, his beloved daughter, in whom he had written, "I have always found unwavering strength, profound integrity, and an echo of her dear mother." The air in the conference room crackled with raw, unadulterated disbelief. Brenda's face, moments before pale with feigned sorrow, transformed into a horrifying canvas of blotchy, furious red. Leo's jaw literally dropped, his mouth hanging agape, while Tiffany looked as though she might actually faint or be physically sick, her face a sickly green. But Mr. Henderson, unflappable, was not yet finished. He then unfolded my father's handwritten letter. He read it slowly, deliberately, his voice clear and steady, each word dropping like a heavy stone into the suffocating, shocked silence of the room. My father's words, raw and painfully honest, painted a vivid, damning picture of Brenda's relentless, systematic manipulation, her calculated lies, her insatiable greed. He spoke of his own agonizing regret, his profound blindness, and his deep, abiding shame at having allowed himself to be turned against me, his only child. He praised my resilience, my quiet dignity in the face of such cruelty. He stated with unshakable clarity that this secret will was his desperate final attempt to right a terrible, grievous wrong, to ensure that his true hard-earned legacy went to the person who genuinely deserved it, the person who embodied the values he had for a dark and regrettable time tragically forgotten. When Mr. Henderson finally finished reading and carefully folded the letter, you could have heard a feather drop. Then the dam of their composure burst and chaos erupted. Brenda was instantly on her feet, her voice a screech, sputtering, "This is a forgery. A complete and utter lie. She manipulated him. He was sick. He wasn't of sound mind when he wrote that nonsense." Leo was shouting incoherently, his face purple with rage, while Tiffany was now openly, hysterically sobbing. Real tears this time, tears of pure, unadulterated fury and thwarted, desperate greed. Their meticulously constructed world, built on lies and deceit, was spectacularly, publicly crumbling around them. The distant relatives and my father's former business partners were staring, their expressions a mixture of profound shock, dawning understanding, and thinly veiled disgust directed squarely at Brenda and her children. The triumphant, mocking laughter I remembered so painfully from that awful night years ago was utterly extinguished, replaced by their shrill, panicked, and ultimately futile accusations. But their wild, desperate words held no power now. The undeniable truth in my father's own unmistakable hand had silenced them far more effectively, far more devastatingly, than any argument I could have ever hoped to make. The self-satisfied smirks were wiped clean from their faces, replaced by masks of pure, impotent fury and complete, inescapable public humiliation. It wasn't just about the vast sums of money they'd lost. It was about the brutal, public exposure of their true, despicable natures, in front of everyone they had sought to impress. The revenge was absolute, exquisitely complete, and it was served on a platter of ice-cold, undeniable truth. The immediate aftermath was every bit as dramatic and tumultuous as the revelation itself. Brenda, Leo, and Tiffany, true to their grasping, entitled natures, immediately tried to contest the secret will. They hired a succession of increasingly expensive and aggressive lawyers, loudly claiming undue influence on my part, vehemently questioning my father's mental capacity at the time of its creation. But my father, perhaps anticipating their venomous reaction, or perhaps wisely guided by Mr. Henderson's astute legal counsel, had made the secret will absolutely ironclad. There were sworn affidavits from his attending physicians confirming his complete lucidity during that period, multiple notarized signatures from credible witnesses, and even a discreetly made video recording of him calmly and clearly stating his intentions and reasons, a recording Mr. Henderson had kept securely locked away in his firm's vault. Their increasingly desperate legal challenges crumbled, one after another, each failure costing them a significant chunk of the already diminished inheritance they had received from the first, now largely irrelevant, will. They were ultimately left with the main house, which, as it turned out, carried a hefty mortgage Brenda had cajoled my father into taking out for her extravagant renovations, and the initial sums of money which were rapidly, almost comically, depleted by their mounting legal fees and their ingrained inability to curb their lavish, unsustainable spending habits. Their carefully cultivated social standing, once propped up by my father's considerable wealth and respected reputation, plummeted spectacularly. Contemptuous whispers and thinly veiled snubs followed them everywhere they went. The salacious story of the secret will, of their shocking deceit and my father's ultimate dramatic act of redemption, became a widely circulated, deliciously juicy piece of gossip in their former elite circles. The cruel laughter they had once so freely directed at me was now a distant, haunting echo, replaced by the scornful sneers and pitying glances of others. As for me, the inheritance was initially overwhelming. It was a sum of money far beyond anything I had ever imagined possessing. But infinitely more valuable than the financial windfall was the profound, soul-deep vindication, the undeniable knowledge that my father had, in his own flawed and belated way, sought my forgiveness and bravely acknowledged the painful truth. Ben and I discussed it at great length over many thoughtful evenings. We used a portion of it to secure our future, to ensure a comfortable life for ourselves and any family we might have. But the bulk of it, the vast majority, went into establishing a charitable foundation in my mother's name. A foundation dedicated to supporting young, struggling artists and promoting literacy programs in underserved communities, causes she, and indeed my father in his earlier better days, had genuinely and passionately cared for. It felt like the most fitting way to honor both their memories, the good and true parts of who they were. Life eventually settled into a new, more peaceful normal. A more comfortable normal, certainly, but the profound peace I found didn't just stem from financial security. It blossomed from a deep sense of closure. The simmering anger and resentment I had carried for so many years, a heavy burden on my heart, began to slowly, steadily dissipate, replaced by a more complex, nuanced understanding. My father wasn't a one-dimensional villain, nor was he a flawless hero. He was a deeply flawed human man who had made terrible, hurtful mistakes under the insidious influence of a profoundly manipulative woman, but who had, in the end, found the courage to try and make things right. His final act, however late it came, was undeniably one of love, of atonement. Sometimes, even now, I think back to that dreadful day in my father's grand living room, to the chilling sound of their cruel, triumphant laughter. It no longer stings. It's just a distant, faded memory, a stark reminder of how swiftly fortunes can turn, how deeply deceit can wound, and most importantly, how powerfully and completely the truth can ultimately heal. They stopped laughing that day in Mr. Henderson's office. Their mirth choked in their throats, replaced by the bitter taste of their own medicine. And in the quiet, enduring satisfaction of justice finally, unequivocally served, of peace hard-won and deeply cherished, I finally found my own genuine, lasting reasons to smile.